I spent Christmas as a 1940s housewife, and here's how it went. Ho, ho, ho. There is something about a 1940s Christmas that people find fascinating. But not just fascinating, strangely nostalgic. And that is no truer than in Britain. Perhaps it comes from a sense of patriotism. The idea that Christmas celebrations still defiantly took place even whilst our nation was under siege. Maybe it reminds us in the modern day to be grateful as we think back to all those resourceful families that made do at Christmas, with children excitedly rummaging around their stocking hoping to find an orange. Sometimes I wonder if it was Christmas's innocence, the way that people didn't want for much except the warm embrace of those that they loved and the long-forgotten feeling of safety. Either way, the idea of paper chains draped over a fireplace that faces a tin bath in the centre of a living room with the sound of a wireless radio in the background is fixed into our collective memory. I, for one, learnt about the 40s at school. Many will have heard stories from their grandparents. But nevertheless, it is a period of history that people revisit, especially at Christmas. And today, I'm going to show you how Britain celebrated Christmas during the Second World War, and I've linked some of my sources of research in the video description. At 11:15 a.m. on Sunday the 3rd of September 1939, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain declared in a 5-minute broadcast that Britain was at war with Germany. This would see the start of 6 years at war, and that December was to be the last ration-free Christmas in all of that time, as rationing began in January 1940. This brought many changes to familiar festive rituals. Christmas celebrations often had to be scaled down or adjusted as restrictions and shortages took their toll. By December 1940, the UK was in the middle of the Blitz, a series of devastating air raids by German forces that had begun on September 7th. Tens of thousands of lives were lost, with people suffering the death of a family member either in action or from enemy bombing raids. By the end of the war, thousands of families had lost loved ones, with the death of 384,000 soldiers and 70,000 civilians. And there were a few different names for Christmas during these unthinkable moments in history. In 1939, it was coined the Dark Christmas. In 1940, it was called Blitzmas. In 1941, Homemade Christmas, and in 1942, Austerity Christmas. Today is going to be very interesting as I spend Christmas like it's the 1940s. But of course, one of the elements of a wartime Christmas that I cannot experience is of course a war, and I am very, very grateful for that. But there are so many other elements of a Christmas taking place in the 1940s that I can experience and I want to experience. I find this era really interesting to study. I've done so much research on this, and how could I not? I mean, I've already spent the day as a 1940s housewife, and then I've done Halloween in the 1940s, and when it comes to Christmas, I absolutely couldn't miss this one out. I really don't know how it's going to go, but if there's one thing I'm pretty sure of, it's that I'm going to learn a lot. So I have a lot to do today to prepare my home for the festive celebrations, but in the 1940s, many people would have actually spent their Christmas underground. In London, millions of people were regularly spending nights in the underground shelters, singing and dancing their way through the festive season, which was likely due to the fact that Christmas carol singing on the street was banned due to the blackouts. There were also performances of festive plays and pantomimes. And in 1940, between September and November, London was bombed for 57 consecutive nights. And as Christmas Day approached, the bombing campaign showed no sign of slowing. And so a lot of people were spending their Christmas Eve in an Anderson shelter. Now, with no Anderson or underground shelter for my festive celebrations or to don my paper chains, I'll be spending Christmas at home. Today, I'll be decorating my house in popular wartime decorations, wrapping typical Christmas presents, making a rationed Christmas dinner, and enjoying 1940s Christmas celebrations. Now, Christmas decorations were scarcely available to buy in shops, and so often people would make their own.
And one of the most popular choices was to make your own paper chains. And this is because they were easy to make and they were also easy to source, because you could just make them out of bits of scrap paper and newspaper. And the reason I like making paper chains is it's just a really mindful activity. You can kind of just sit and just with intention make these decorations and let your mind wander. It doesn't take much concentration. Now, these paper chains that I'm using are probably a little bit bougie actually, because like I said, it would just be any kind of paper that you could get your hands on. But I've gone for a more festive theme of colours. But I can just imagine, you know, mothers sitting in their living room as their children played on the carpet with the hum of the wireless in the background, just making this simple piece of decoration that adds so much to the festive season. I mean, there's a reason that these haven't gone out of style even today. They just make the entire thing feel a bit more like a party. I don't know if it's just because they've been around for a long time, but don't paper chains just scream nostalgia to you? I cannot remember a party as a kid that I didn't go to where paper chains weren't making an appearance. Honestly, move over bunting, because paper chains own the festive season. Shall we jump to a here's one I made earlier?
As would be traditional, we have draped them all around our living room, interspersed with these lovely paper decorations that I found in an antique store that the lady said were likely from the 1940s. Well, they must have been popular for decades to come, as I'm pretty sure that I've spotted decorations very similar in classic Only Fools and Horses episodes. And I just think that they add so much to the room, and so this is something that we'll definitely be doing every year from now on.
This is one of the things that I admire most about the 1940s, and that is their sheer creativity. They would even go as far as to collect pine cones and then cover them in Epsom salt to mimic snow. I mean, that's genius. Around the fireplace, which would have been the heart of many a living room during the 1940s, we've got an array of decorations. So we've got our traditional paper decorations, which we already know were hugely popular. We've got some hand-picked holly going around the mantelpiece and the picture frame, which would have been easy to source if you were near to somewhere where holly grew, and also it was free. We've got our stockings, which were actual socks, usually stuffed with treats like oranges or nuts. And we've got our Christmas cards. Now, these were often printed on flimsy wartime paper, and you might notice a lot smaller than the cards we know today. And that was due to paper shortages, which we'll get to later.
But as we are not suffering from paper shortages in 2024, I wanted to take this opportunity to adopt that make-do-amends spirit by making my very own Christmas crackers using nothing more than toilet roll and crepe paper. An incredibly cheap alternative to buying Christmas crackers from a store, which can actually be quite pricey. The technique is simple. Cut your crepe paper down to size and then lay your toilet roll in the centre and roll the crepe paper over it to mimic the shape of a cracker. Fix it in place with sellotape and then use ribbon or string to tie both ends. And of course, ensure that you buy festive coloured crepe paper like reds and greens. Repeat this process for as many crackers as you want, and then be sure to add a nice little surprise inside so that when people pull the cracker, they get a little gift. This wasn't only fun to do, but it saved me money and gave me a bespoke piece of decoration to have on my Christmas table.
Okay, cool. Hey!
It was also encouraged that people post their Christmas cards by the 20th of December. This was because in wartime, finding adequate numbers of postal workers to deal with the influx of extra letters and parcels at Christmas became more of a problem, as many permanent staff members were in the armed services. There were also less spaces available to carry mail on the railways, which were needed for transport of troops and munitions. So tell me, have you posted your Christmas cards yet?
Now, at the heart of any Christmas is, of course, the Christmas tree. But during the 1940s, these were often in short supply due to shipping problems. So people would take to making their own out of chicken wire. And believe me, they look much more adorable than they sound. But the other option was going up to the loft and salvaging your artificial trees from Christmases gone by. And in the late 1930s, you could buy trees from popular stores like Woolworths. Man, does anybody remember Woolworths?
As for decorations on your tree, it would include baubles and tinsel mainly, but usually only a scant few lights, perhaps a single fixture of 7 lights, as lights were not as common back then. We've added a nostalgic glow with these retro Santa lights. Now, we'd usually have more lights, but for the sake of staying authentic, we've kept these to a minimal. I don't know the age of these lights, likely not the 1940s, and so if anyone happens to know the age of them, then please drop a comment.
Tinsel, however, was a big thing, and my favourite fact about tinsel is how the British population sourced their tinsel during the 1940s. So, get this. Allegedly, German and Allied forces would use something called chaff to throw radars off their targets. And the British people, because the chaff was kind of silvery and would have made for great decoration, used to collect these and then hang them on their Christmas tree. Honestly, what an act of defiance during such a devastating time.
So yes, the Christmas tree would have a ton of tinsel but few lights, and many Christmas trees at the time were decorated with handmade decorations such as paper spirals and paper cutouts of diamonds to replace glittering glass baubles. And sometimes old light bulbs were painted and hung around the house or placed on homemade trees. Now, Christmas luxuries were hard to come by at a time when even basic foods were scarce, and so gifts were often homemade and practical, and children's toys were often made from recycled materials. And in 1941, to conserve paper, the Ministry of Supply decreed that no retailer shall provide any paper for the packaging or wrapping of goods excepting foodstuffs or articles which the shopkeeper had agreed to deliver. This made it somewhat difficult to keep Christmas presents a surprise. Presents were often wrapped in brown paper, newspaper, or even small pieces of cloth.
One thing that I've realised from my research as to why a 1940s Christmas feels so homemade, and arguably that's what adds the element of charm, is because it had to be. People just didn't have the spare cash for elaborate, exciting or generous gifts. And I think in a cost of living crisis, we can all relate to that even just a little bit. And so the gifts would be homemade or from recycled materials. And sometimes they would have war themes like gas mask cases or tinned helmets. I know that playing cards, cigarettes and dartboards were also a popular choice. And you would get about 1 to 2 presents per person if you were lucky. But let me give you some examples on how the make, do, amend spirit really did have a presence in a wartime Christmas. So scarves, gloves and hats would be hand knitted from wool unravelled from old jumpers that household members had outgrown. War bonds were also given as gifts, which in turn helped the war effort. Preserves, jams and chutneys were also welcome presents. And if you wanted to buy something a bit more practical, for example, for a gardener, you could buy them wooden dibbers for planting. But the most popular gift of the 1940s? Soap. These days there has been a revival in thrifting your Christmas gifts, and I actually made a video about this entire topic. But in the 1940s, make, do, amend really was the order of the day, with pretty much all of the gifts being homemade or renovated. In 1941, the Newcastle Chronicle gave tips on how to turn a plain-looking glass bowl into a real expensive-looking gift of beauty by using nothing but tin-foiled sweet wrappers. And in the Birmingham Daily Post, December 1940, it describes how you can make a bed for a small doll using a cigarette box and clothe her using basic materials. Other gift ideas would be embroidered bookmarks and also brooches made from wood, felt and cutlery. How does one make a brooch out of cutlery?
Christmas entertainment was a key element for keeping people company during the long nights of bombing raids. Radio was very important to people. It was their way of getting news, but they also enjoyed the light relief of comedy programmes. The BBC also broadcast a special Christmas Day radio programme, and from 1939 onwards, this featured a Christmas speech by King George VI. And it was so popular with listeners that it became an annual ritual that we still know in Britain to this day. Piano entertainment was also enjoyed, especially in pubs, and people loved Bing Crosby and his song White Christmas and the songs of Vera Lynn. In the early days of the war, it looked as if all places of public entertainment would be closed indefinitely, and one by one the country's theatres opened their doors and the world of pantomime existed as a glittering escape from the streets ravaged by nightly air raids. Pantomimes had survived the onslaught of cinema, and in these pre-television days drew performers from popular radio and variety shows to provide some of the greatest pantomime stars. But cinema was still a well-loved pastime pastime, particularly comedy war films, and a film called In Which We Serve, 1942, was produced to raise morale. And therefore, this was the perfect excuse for me to visit a local cinema which was built in 1935 in true Art Deco style, not only retaining its original marquee, but still functioning as a working cinema today. Other forms of entertainment included football, games, dance halls, card games, and board games. Now, imagine running down to your festive table on Christmas Day to find no sign of a turkey, or goose, or piles of chocolate, or much of anything. By Christmas 1942, almost all foods apart from bread and fresh fruit and vegetables were rationed, and so people were forced to get creative.
So it's finally time to make Christmas dinner, but in the 1940s, Christmas dinner didn't look like it does today by a long shot. So I'm a little bit apprehensive about how this is going to turn out, but I'm also very excited just to try something new. But I am going to put my hair in a hairnet just to keep everything out of the way whilst I cook. Perfect. Just how Grandma used to wear it. So I've laid out everything that I'm going to need to prepare a traditional 1940s Christmas dinner. And you're probably sat there thinking, none of those items look like what I'm used to seeing on my Christmas table. And no, they wouldn't have been. By 1943, the Ministry of Food predicted that only 1 in 10 families could hope to have a real turkey or a real goose on their Christmas table. And so what people would tend to do is they would make mock versions of classic Christmas recipes, mock Christmas pudding, mock goose, and mock turkey, which I've otherwise heard called murky, but I will absolutely not be calling it that because let's face it, that sounds god-awful. But what I am going to be doing is making a 1940s mock Christmas turkey. And if you'd like to see exactly how I put together this Christmas feast, then you can.
Rationing meant that the traditional Christmas dinner was off the menu, which meant people used substitute ingredients to make staples such as turkey, plum pudding, or Christmas cake. But not to worry, because in a Ministry of Food advertisement in December 1942, it was announced that it will take more than Hitler to stop the British housewife from setting a festive table at Christmas time. By dressing up the old favourites, using little tricks of flavouring, garnishing, and serving, we can still put up a festive show. And so that meant reaching for stale breadcrumbs, grated carrots, and potato to bulk up savoury and sweet meals. From using dried eggs and cold tea to darken a plum pudding, to mock goose made from sliced layers of potato, apple, and grated cheese. Delicious. By Christmas 1943, this was an example of the food that was available. Horse meat, plenty of it, tinned fish, but it wasn't very popular, spam, which became very popular and was often made into fritters, and people started trying to make their own wine and beer. But everything was in short supply, and because of the shortage of fuel, few deliveries could be made, which impacted many things. Of course, people could still save some of their ration tokens and use them at Christmas, but this took some doing. And the black market in exchange of foodstuffs and goods took off during this time, despite there being hefty fines. However, by this point, the GIs had arrived, and many were hosted by British families at Christmas. And with them, they brought gifts of food that brightened many a family's day. And for many, the arrival of GIs was most beneficial because of the company that they provided. British houses were feeling the emptiness of loved ones either fighting abroad in the armed forces or being held as prisoners of war. And the women were also often away from home in the services or carrying out war work. But the lack of presence that was most felt was that of the children, because on September 1st, 1940, the first official evacuation of children took place. And although many children did return for Christmas as the threat appeared low at the time, for many families, this was the most difficult part of a wartime Christmas. And despite some returning, many children spent Christmas away from home. A Christmas without your own children. I can't imagine such pain.
You know, as I sit here eating my mock Christmas dinner, I can't help but think of all those people in the 1940s that would have had to have Christmas dinner alone. It must have been a really lonely, nostalgic, bittersweet time because so many people would have been far away from their loved ones. I mean, that aspect, loneliness, having Christmas dinner alone on Christmas Day, is by no means unique to the 1940s because there will be so many people out there who probably feel quite lonely on Christmas even today, in an age where we should feel so connected and yet so many people are feeling so isolated. I mean, alone or not, it still tastes good.
In 1944, the last wartime Christmas, a freezing fog hung around many parts of Britain, and 30 doodlebugs hit towns from Derby to County Durham on Christmas Eve. Deep shelters were being used in London by the hundreds, but finally there were glimmers of hope. Things in Europe were going well. Some rations were eased, such as margarine, sugar and sweets, and for the first time in years, churches' stained glass windows could be lit as the threat from conventional aircraft was deemed low.
And then on the 8th of May 1945, the war finally ended in Britain and all of Europe. And we never had to endure a wartime Christmas again, or a Christmas morning without our family. And yet, after all these years, those Christmases still linger in our collective memory, interlinked with a strange sense of nostalgia, whether we were there or not. Perhaps it's because of the unbelievability that people actually lived through that and still found the resolve to celebrate. Maybe it's their sheer resourcefulness which puts us to shame in a world of overconsumption. Or perhaps they just make us hold on to our loved ones that little bit tighter and be grateful that we get to be together.